Most people think wars are won by generals' weapons or courage, but money decides endurance. The real story begins when fighting stopped being cheap and started demanding constant financing globally. Early wars relied on people who already lived, worked, farmed, and returned home afterward peacefully. Armies were temporary gatherings, not permanent institutions, draining resources every single day of the state economy. Overall, seasonal limits, food shortages, and geography naturally restrained violence without formal financial systems in place. Gunpowder changed everything, not by brutality alone, but by permanently raising the price of conflict. Stone walls that once protected cities became liabilities, requiring redesign engineers, materials, and ongoing investment. Weapons now demanded supply chains, maintenance training, and steady funding far beyond individual soldiers' capacity. This shift quietly transformed war into an industrial process dependent on logistics, accounting, and cash flow. Soldiers became full-time professionals consuming resources daily, even when no battles occurred anywhere nearby. Victory slowly favored states that could keep paying rather than those with superior bravery alone. Local lords and small kingdoms simply could not afford cannons, fortresses, and modern armies sustainably. Power centralized because only governments with predictable revenue streams could survive constant military expenses. Long-term permanent taxation replaced occasional levies, turning payment into an expectation rather than emergency measures historically. Even taxes were insufficient, so borrowing evolved from desperation into deliberate state strategy over time. Debt allowed wars to continue longer than public patience or immediate resources permitted. Ever historically, credit became a weapon as powerful as cannons, enabling endurance without popular enthusiasm at home. Once costs could be delayed, wars expanded beyond natural limits imposed by society. Before then, inflation entered, quietly spreading financial pain across everyone, instead of demanding immediate sacrifice, upfront taxes. Rising prices reduced the real burden of debt, while appearing less politically explosive to voters. Most people miss that inflation historically functioned as a pressure valve for states under stress. Instead of defaults, governments repaid creditors with weaker money over time, gradually, quietly, predictably, systemically. This made permanent war financially survivable, even as savings and wages eroded for households slowly. Once normalized, these tools extended beyond war, shaping entire economic and political systems across societies. Military spending stopped being temporary and became a standing feature of government budgets worldwide. Today, central authority strengthened because coordination was required to manage debt, armies, and inflation together effectively. War no longer needed constant consent, it needed liquidity and financial infrastructure to persist indefinitely. People far from battlefields still paid through higher prices, weaker savings, and inherited obligations. Silently. Entire generations carried costs from conflicts decided long before they were born, without choice. Consent. Modern warfare follows the same logic. Budgets, technology, logistics, and financing determine outcomes globally now. Manpower matters less than aircraft carriers, satellites, cyber systems, and supply chains, funded, maintained continuously. The real competition is endurance, who can afford to keep going longest under pressure financially. Restraint rarely comes from morality alone. It comes from unbearable cost imposed by systems collapsing. When costs are hidden, deferred, or diluted, restraint weakens dramatically over time within complex states. Debt, inflation, and public finance are therefore inseparable from discussions of power, historically, politically, practically. These are not abstract numbers, they enable force projection without immediate collapse of governments today. The roots lie centuries ago when technology made violence too expensive informally to manage sustainably. Gunpowder reshaped not only battlefields but the financial foundations of authority across states and empires. Once money bridged the gap between ambition and cost, it remained essential for power forever. That bridge is rarely dismantled because systems adapt around sustaining it through policy habit inertia. History may not repeat, but it consistently echoes through financial structures, shaping choices, incentives, outcomes. Understanding this helps explain borrowing inflation and permanent military budgets today across many countries worldwide. In my opinion, ignoring these links leaves people confused about government behavior during crises, conflicts. Most people focus on headlines instead of the deeper machinery underneath shaping outcomes, long term. Once you see the system, wars feel less sudden and more structural by design historically. Power depends on endurance, and endurance depends on financial control of revenue debt, currency inflation. This connection explains why states appear durable, even after costly conflicts that strain societies deeply. Costs are spread, delayed and softened until resistance fades or adapts within populations over time. War feels distant because payment is embedded in everyday economic life through prices, taxes, debt. That distance is not peace, it is financial insulation created by modern state systems deliberately. Today, technology again raises costs, forcing money to shoulder power ambitions at unprecedented scale globally. Budgets determine strategy just as surely as weapons determine tactics on modern battlefields today everywhere. Whoever controls finance controls time, and time decides victory in prolonged conflicts between powerful states. This reality demands realism, not cynicism, when analyzing global affairs through economic, historical, and political understanding. Systems help citizens ask better questions about policy and war spending. Debt inflation power. It reminds us that technology reshapes institutions upstream in unexpected ways, with lasting consequences globally. When costs rise, institutions evolve to absorb them rather than disappear under competitive pressure historically. That evolution explains much of modern governance, finance, and authority seen across nations today worldwide. Ignoring history makes current debt inflation debates seem irrational instead of structurally logical responses evolving. Once you trace origins, patterns become clearer and less mysterious within long-term power cycles. Finance is not separate from force. It enables force endurance across decades of conflict cycles. The battlefield may change, but the funding question remains constant across eras, technologies, and empires. Understanding money means understanding how power survives: stress during prolonged competition, scarcity crisis, and war. This perspective reframes headlines into longer stories about systems that quietly shape outcomes over time. It also explains why reform is difficult. Once systems stabilize around debt inflation power structures, change threatens endurance, and endurance is what states prioritize when facing external rivals and risks. War funding teaches a brutal lesson about what truly limits action in global politics. Historically, limits are financial long before they are moral within competitive international systems under pressure. Always recognizing this does not justify war, but clarifies its persistence within modern state systems globally. Power structures evolve to sustain themselves under rising costs imposed by technology, competition, and ambition. Money becomes the connective tissue holding those structures together through credit, taxation, inflation, debt systems. Without financial adaptation, many states would collapse under pressure from prolonged conflict. Spending demands alone. This is why finance and power remain inseparable today, despite changing narratives, technologies, and ideologies. Understanding this relationship makes you a more informed observer of global events, policy, decisions, conflicts. It shifts focus from personalities to systems and incentives that drive decisions over long horizons. Systems outlast leaders and shape outcomes regardless of intentions behind individual actions, policies, choices made. This is where history, finance, and strategy intersect to explain modern power structures clearly today. Seeing that intersection helps decode why governments behave predictably under fiscal pressure. Security concerns globally. Once you notice it, you cannot unsee the pattern repeating across centuries. Economies, conflicts worldwide. It changes how you interpret debt inflation and defense spending in news cycles today, constantly. These are signals of endurance strategy, not random mismanagement within competitive international systems, historically evolving money. quietly does the work that force alone cannot sustain over long periods of conflict. That insight alone reframes how power actually operates behind the scenes of modern states globally. Understanding this makes history feel practical rather than academic by connecting past mechanisms to present. It shows why financial literacy is also political literacy in complex modern societies today worldwide. Knowing how systems fund power helps citizens engage critically with policy debates, elections, budgets, wars. This awareness does not solve problems, but sharpens judgment about trade-offs, consequences, incentives, risks involved. Once sharpened judgment replaces outrage with informed skepticism toward official narratives, spending priorities. Power claims. That is how understanding finance ultimately empowers individuals within large systems of power and governance. If this perspective helped you subscribe for more deep dives like this on History, Finance, Power.